Community of West African States, Authority of Heads of State and Government, holding in Abuja. It is focused on the peace, political and security situation in the ECOWAS sub-region. In his welcome address, the bloc's chairman, President Bola Tinubu, emphasized the importance of a comprehensive and collaborative approach to addressing pressing security and peace developments, as well as political situations in the republics of Niger, Burkina Faso, Guinea, and Mali.
Times like this, currently, we face in our sub-region demand that we take difficult but courageous decisions that put the plight of our people at the center of our deliberations. This is why we must re-examine our current approach to the quest for constitutional order in 4 of our member states.
He also reaches out to the military leaders in the 4 countries.
I therefore urge them to reconsider the decision of these 3 nations to exit our home and not to perceive our organization as the enemy. Of course, we are not the enemy.
The meeting then goes behind closed doors. Over 2 hours later, it is time to receive the resolutions reached.
The authority has resolved as follows. Release of President Bazoum. The authority calls for the immediate release of His Excellency Mohamed Bazoum, former President of the Republic of Niger. The authority also calls on the transition authorities in Niger to provide an acceptable transition timetable to constitutional order.
He also announced the lifting of some of the sanctions imposed on some of the countries.
The authority has resolved to lift with immediate effect the following measures imposed on the Republic of Niger. A. Closure of land and air borders between ECOWAS countries and Niger to be lifted. No-fly zone of all commercial flights to and from Niger is to be lifted. Suspension of all commercial and financial transactions between ECOWAS member states and Niger is to be lifted. This decision is based on humanitarian considerations, especially as we are in the month of Lent and as we prepare for the holy month of Ramadan. The authority has also resolved to lift financial and economic sanctions on the Republic of Guinea.
A resolution was also taken on the notice of withdrawal by the 3 countries.
The authority takes note and further urges the countries to reconsider the decision in view of the benefits that the ECOWAS member states and their citizens enjoy in the community. The authority further urges the 3 member states to resort dialogue, negotiations and mediation to address their concerns.
In response to the political crisis in Senegal, the authority urges Senegalese stakeholders to prioritize discussion in order to preserve Senegal's democratic advances through free, inclusive, and transparent elections. From the State House, Lanre Lasisi, Channels Television News.
Let's have conversations around that which you just saw on your screen before this very moment. Bayo Oluwake joins us this morning. He's an international affairs analyst. He joins us virtually from Lagos. Thank you for joining us this morning, Mr. Oluwake. Perhaps, just by way of understanding exactly what has just happened. Is it the ECOWAS rescinding on its decision, biting the bullets, going back on its word, kowtowing, or really, as the statement says, being considerate based on humanitarian grounds? What exactly has happened?
Good morning, and thank you for having me. It was a momentous summit, and I believe strongly that the outcome of that summit converges with the position that quite a number of concerned observers had made at the very beginning of this crisis, especially when Niger fell into a military government. I think the best description would be to say that with regard to Niger, ECOWAS has now effected the recognition of the military government in Niger. Just going by the statement read by the chairperson of the ECOWAS Commission that you just broadcast, he referred, in calling for the release of President Bazoum, he referred to him as the former president of Niger. And then he went on to say ECOWAS wants an acceptable transition timetable, the no-fly zone for commercial aircraft, and the land borders that have been closed were opened, financial and economic sanctions were lifted. That's on Niger. And then, of course, on Guinea, all the sanctions, financial and economic sanctions on Guinea were also lifted. And then, of course, it was quite interesting to hear ECOWAS say that all parties in Senegal should work together towards the success of the transition to the next republic. Now, remember that ECOWAS had issued a press release some weeks back in which it said it understood the conditions warranting the postponement of elections in Senegal as announced by President Macky Sall. And I think ECOWAS would be embarrassed by the Supreme Court decision in Senegal proclaiming the postponement of those elections by President Sall as unconstitutional. So all in all, ECOWAS has corrected itself, but I think the most important thing for us here is to acknowledge that the decisions that ECOWAS has taken are in the spirit, those decisions are a victory for Pan-Africanism.
So on the one hand, it's a victory for Pan-Africanism. There are those who are also listening now and would say, okay, the initial decision was a diplomatic error. What would you respond? What would you say to them in response?
They will be correct. Those who hold this view will be correct. And otherwise, ECOWAS will not announce this cocktail of reversals. It's obvious that I personally also feel that deeper consultation could have taken place before those rush of sanctions were announced. And what actually buttresses this position and might actually strengthen the hands of those who hold that opinion will be the fact that, take the Republic of Ghana. Ghana and Burkina Faso are neighbors. Burkina Faso uses Ghanaian ports to import goods and services. Burkina Faso relies on Ghana for the supply of electricity. It is quite instructive that despite ECOWAS sanctions, Ghana did not close its ports to Burkina Faso, and Ghana did not cut off electricity supply to Burkina Faso. So this would strengthen the hands of those who might say that ECOWAS probably made a blunder, not just in the rush of decisions that were announced, but even in the coordination of the enforcement of the sanctions. Because while a country like Nigeria, for instance, was faithful to ECOWAS, regardless of internal disagreement by Nigerian citizens with some of those decisions, nonetheless, the Nigerian authorities kept faith with ECOWAS. But another ECOWAS member, as I just mentioned, did not bother to effect any of those sanctions. And what did ECOWAS do to that country? Nothing.
Okay, so now with this, and I'm sure that my colleagues in Abuja want to join in the conversation for, at some point. But before then, what part of the expectation of that statement also says that Nigeria remains open for engagement with Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger, so that all the people of the region can continue to enjoy the economic benefits and democratic values that ECOWAS embraces. How do you see these three countries responding?
This is a very, very critical question. I believe strongly that there should have been back-channel diplomatic negotiations before ECOWAS came to this point of reversing itself. Because if there had not been those back-channel diplomatic negotiations, either directly or through track 2 functionaries, then ECOWAS may end up being embarrassed if, despite reversing itself, those three countries were to go ahead and insist that they are not returning to ECOWAS. Indeed, Captain Ibrahim Traore of Burkina Faso, in an interview he granted just a couple of days back, had insisted that there would be no return to ECOWAS. Brigadier General Abdurrahman Tiani of Niger also granted an interview a couple of days ago where he went down memory lane to explain how ECOWAS was formed, his own version of that. Most of it, I think, were correct, but there are certain interesting points he added to it, which I think were from his own perspective. But then he was concluding that interview by asserting that they were not returning to ECOWAS. So in view of such interviews granted by these two out of the three heads of state of the countries that announced their pullout, I was expecting, and I would have expected, that ECOWAS would have reached some sort of understanding with them that they will return if these sanctions were reversed.
But then another angle to that, I'm talking about some back-channel communication. We also recall that about 4 days ago or thereabout, former head of state Yakubu Gowon asked ECOWAS to lift the sanctions. And of course, perhaps in response, that also happened. I mean, I don't think anyone would assume that it was because of just that one conversation. There are a number of other people or things that may have happened, just as you said. So in the event that these countries do not return to ECOWAS, what are the implications and what are the options for Nigeria as a country and her nationals, particularly along the borders?
Okay, first, I would say that the role that General Gowon played is very instrumental. And I don't think we should, it's good you mentioned it, it's very critical. He's the only founding father, he's the only one out of the founding fathers of ECOWAS who is still alive. And ECOWAS was actually championed by General Yakubu Gowon and the late President Gnassingbé Eyadema of Togo. These two were the pivots of the
I think we're trying to get that connection back, but that's a very critical point that we would have loved to hear more. Can we hear him? Is he back?
Will be the impact of this. I think, first of all, the sanctions from the interview I referred to, granted by Brigadier General Chani, it was obvious from what he said that the sanctions had severe impact, not just on the state of Niger, but on the population of Niger. In fact, he went on to say that people were dying in Niger as a consequence of the sanctions. I don't know if that can be verified, but if you consider the cutoff of electricity supply and the fact that most West African countries do not have a generator mentality like we have in Nigeria, many of them don't have personal generators to power their homes in the event of power failure. So it is most likely that hospitals, for instance, will have been terribly hit by the cutoff of electricity, which could lead to people losing their lives, as Brigadier General Chiani was alluding to. But going to the question of the implication of this on a wider scale, especially also for Nigeria, I think strongly that the decision of ECOWAS is the right one to make in view of the reality in which we find ourselves in the sub-region. And I think it can only be good for the people, especially of those three countries, particularly Niger, because Niger was extremely terribly hit. You remember that the other countries have been under military a bit longer than Niger and had somewhat adapted to the sanctions that were imposed on them. But for Niger, those other countries also had options. Burkina Faso had options using Ghanaian ports, could also use the ports of Guinea, just like Mali could use the ports of Guinea and maybe the ports of Ghana. But in the case of Niger, she doesn't have that luxury. Alternative ports are extremely far away. So I think it's a great blessing. I think it will be welcomed by the people of Niger. I hope that the three leaders of these countries will respond favorably. It is best for us to have a bigger union to enhance our negotiation power with other blocs and other continents around the world. Now, for Nigeria, I think it's also a positive development, considering that our citizens in Kano and Katsina states in particular have relatives across the border in Niger. Nigeria has tremendous trade relationship, especially with regard to livestock. And furthermore, Niger has been a very important partner in the multinational joint task force comprising of Benin Republic, Cameroon, Chad, Niger, and Nigeria that have been confronting ISWAP and Boko Haram. And removing Niger from, placing Niger continuously under sanctions could ultimately undermine the meeting game fighting against these insurgents.
All right, Mr. Lowake, just so we can understand a few more things about this, the concept of sanctions is to get someone to stop doing something wrong. We're talking about the economic impacts and how it's affecting people of Niger and all these other countries, but there's a critical issue, sir, which is the fact that there's no democracy in those places. These people have erred and gone against the values that many countries, including Nigeria, have spent so long trying to enshrine in this region. If these sanctions are not working, and we're seeing ECOWAS, going back on a lot of these sanctions, so how do we get other countries not to copy this bad behavior? We do agree that being undemocratic is bad behavior, do we not?
Absolutely. You've raised a valid point. The question is, should ECOWAS have the same response every time there is a coup? That presupposes that ECOWAS itself is not proactive. You can imagine the first time ECOWAS had military intervention to reverse a coup was when President Ahmad Tejan Kaba of Sierra Leone was overthrown by Lieutenant Colonel Johnny Pokoroma, and Nigeria reversed that through ECOMOG. That was a while back, and that was one country. So we were having individual countries. When Faure Eyadema, the current president of Togo, when his father passed on, he was immediately announced by the military in Togo as the new president of Togo. And ECOWAS said, no, that cannot happen. There must be elections. The Togolese military refused, and the ECOWAS leaders mobilized the military force. Immediately, the Togolese military reversed itself and went ahead to conduct elections. But these were incidents that were just, one country at a time, if you like. But suddenly we have 2-3 countries in the Sahel, or almost Sahel. Guinea is not entirely in the Sahel. And then a 4th country joins them. But it was the same reaction from ECOWAS. And it was also a bit more disturbing in the sense that if you take the case of Niger, Niger has 4 neighbors. 2 of them are ECOWAS members. 2 others are not ECOWAS members. Algeria is not an ECOWAS member. Chad is not an ECOWAS member. Nigeria and Benin are ECOWAS members. And maybe also Mali. There's a border with Mali. So, but the fact was, you cannot successfully impose sanctions on Niger if Chad and Algeria are not on board. So I feel that ECOWAS miscalculated there. And that will be one of the reasons why the sanctions, although they beat hard, on Niger, but they may not have been as effective as ECOWAS would have wanted. So the bottom line is that ECOWAS needed to have gone back to the drawing board, to have reassessed the situation, and now to have determined how to go ahead and effect compliance by these states with this decision. The last point I'll make is...
Sorry to interject, sir. The issue here is that the authority and powers of ECOWAS is being questioned now, because we're looking at this organization with whom we've signed so many treaties, and then it almost feels as though they are unable to ensure discipline among member nations, erring member nations. Does ECOWAS need stronger sanctions? Do we need a stronger body? What can be done to put people in line? Because what's really happening on a broader scale is that we're teaching people to behave badly and rewarding bad behavior. If we say we're going to stop people from breaking rules, from doing coups in 2024, and we're unable to ensure that sanctions are stringent enough to ensure that the countries play along and carry on with these democratic principles, which we have been preaching for a very long time, then what's the point? Should ECOWAS reassess the way it sanctions countries? What do you think can be done?
Absolutely, and this is the point I'm trying to make. ECOWAS needs to reassess how it responds, okay? It doesn't have to always be the same way of responding. We've had, I can cite some examples, although it's not directly an ECOWAS state. We had a president of an African country visiting Nigeria when his overthrow was announced, okay? Now, the Nigerian president at the time, I think it was President Obasanjo, took this president in an aircraft, flew to his country. I'm talking of Sao Tome and Principe, where Nigeria, by the way, has substantial investments in the what is called the Joint Development Zone, which is developing oil blocks in Sao Tome's, fields in the Atlantic Ocean, right? The Nigerian president flew with that president to Sao Tome and insisted that this is your president. When President Kumbayala of Guinea-Bissau was removed in a coup, President Kufuor of Ghana was chairman of ECOWAS. President Obasanjo and President Kufuor flew to Guinea-Bissau and told the soldiers directly that the coup was not recognized and President Kumbayala had to be put back to power. It took a lot of negotiation and threats, carrot and stick and what have you, but President Kumbayala came back to power, although he did resign, but he came back to power. He resigned afterwards, an interim government was set up, and elections were conducted that were financed by ECOWAS. Now, that was not a typical ECOWAS response. So we need to look at particular cases. ECOWAS needs to look at particular cases and determine what kind of measures would work. Some countries, for example, will sanction the leadership of the military directly and leave the citizens out, freeze their bank accounts, restrict their movement, and so on and so forth. So I feel your question is pertinent, but it speaks to ECOWAS itself going back to the drawing board. Also, how ECOWAS manages its decision-making is very important. I just cited the case of Ghana. Ghana is a strong ECOWAS member. Instead of Ghana to do some of the things which other countries have done, Ghana even went ahead to start building an expansion to the power supply network to Burkina Faso. Now, how do you punish Ghana for that? Nothing was done. And then who speaks on behalf of ECOWAS? One of the complaints of these military leaders was that certain ministers of certain countries were arrogated to themselves the power to speak as if they were ECOWAS, and were making pronouncements in certain foreign capitals, which led them to think that the negotiations that they were having with ECOWAS was of no effect if certain ECOWAS members could be saying something completely different. So I think all in all, this is a period for ECOWAS to really learn from what has happened regarding the measures he took about these three countries. While we will say, and those who have been opposed to those sanctions might beat their chest now and say, well, we told ECOWAS, now they are reversing themselves. Like I said, I believe it's a victory for Pan-Africanism. One of the parties had to blink. And I think in the interest of the population of these countries, yes, we may criticize ECOWAS, but I think it's good that ECOWAS is the one that has blinked. Now, let ECOWAS learn from how it has handled these issues. Okay. And hopefully we don't have coups anymore. But if they do happen, let ECOWAS know that it has to find different ways of responding to be effective.
We still have a situation whereby three countries that did the coup still have the leaders who overthrew democratically elected government. So I'll ask you two questions very quickly. I'll ask you two questions very quickly. The first is whether this decision weakens ECOWAS in any way. That's one. And then two, I'll also ask if, and please kindly respond to this as quickly as possible because we're almost out of time. Does this weaken ECOWAS in any way?
I didn't get your first question. I got the second question clearly. So I'll start with the second question and then you can repeat the first one. Does it weaken ECOWAS? Definitely. Diplomatically, ECOWAS is weakened. And without any doubt, because ECOWAS has reversed itself. ECOWAS has referred to President Bazoum that it insisted remain the president as a former president. This is a victory for those three countries, without any doubt.
Okay, so quickly then, now we understand that the ECOWAS Commission chairman has been asked to invite Niger, Burkina Faso, and these other countries that were, Burkina Faso, Niger, Mali, and Guinea to attend technical, consultative, and security meetings of ECOWAS. Given that these other countries have already said they're going to set up their own country grouping, so to speak, do you think that they will respond in positive light to this?
That's a very difficult question to answer. If ECOWAS had engaged in back-channel diplomatic negotiation before it made these announcements, I think, which is what I expect ECOWAS should have done, okay, so that it doesn't lose face. So if it had done that and had gotten an assurance from them that they will respond favorably if all of these sanctions were reversed, then I think they are likely to respond favorably because the sanctions have had effect on them. But if those back-channel negotiations never took place, and if ECOWAS was hoping that by making these announcements, they will come to the negotiation table, they may not come.
Well, it's certainly a situation to keep our eyes on. Well, we have to thank you so much for joining us this morning, Mr. Bayo Oluwake, who is an international affairs analyst. Thank you so much for the analysis on the ECOWAS extraordinary meeting that took place on Saturday.
Thanks for having me.
Well, just before we go, we did tell you that today there will be a Supreme Court swearing in of 11 Supreme Court justices. Yeah, we have the feed right there. So you do stay here with us here on Channels Television as we'll be bringing you live updates of what is happening, not only in the Southeast, which you can see on some of our channels, but also happening right here in Abuja at the swearing in of Supreme Court justices and also at the trial of Nnamdi Kanu, which will be happening at a federal high court much later today. Well, thank you so much for watching today. Maokwe Ogun Yusuf. Have a wonderful week ahead. I am Kayla Nagwa.
And a productive one. Amaya Makide. Bye for now.